When people say, how do we get it on the global agenda, the economic rationale of dealing with nutrition is, I think, self-evident. This is an economic tsunami of man's creation. For industry's contribution, it has to ensure that its recommendations are heard by government and it's up for execution. And governments around the world have to understand that looking at the timescale of response, that it's rather more enabling legislation rather than regulation that we need to see. We need to do something which hasn't been done before, which is to create a new culture of private-public partnership, a new culture which is based on respect, transparency, problem sharing, and understanding that it's only through a true spirited partnership that we can respond with all of the facets of the civil society in terms of the grand challenges of energy and nutrition.
There's some awe about the ability of the industry to reach the most remote villages with commodities, and an envy from the public sector about how do we do that with important global health commodities, and a realization that a partnership in those local distributions for delivering solutions could be a very important area for further scale. There are also two specific calls to action. To the private sector, a call to really define what's necessary for value-based product development. And the challenge to the public sector is really to take the steps towards leadership in defining a focused strategic framework so that all of the real and dedicated efforts of all the different players can be aligned to a common purpose.
I'm a businessman by birth and a public servant by vocation. And since I discovered the shameful reality of chronic malnutrition in our country, half of our children are afflicted with this issue. I had to get involved. I think that one of the key issues that the private sector has to do locally is to make better advocacy for the health and nutrition issues, especially in the countries that are afflicted with malnutrition and undernutrition. We cannot have a successful company in a failed society. And many times we don't recognize that. Private sector has a lot of power. I think we can work at the national level, at the municipal level, even at the community level. If we affect locally, if we show national leadership, the political will come.
If you think about combining infrastructures across a number of companies and a number of industries, it can be very powerful. We do business in well over 200 countries, almost every country in the world. We go into those countries. We have trucks that go in. We have people on the ground in those countries. What can you do with that? We clearly aren't using the full force of that system. So how could we do that together in some sort of consortium? Once you get a critical mass of a partnership, you can make that partnership bigger by leveraging it and inviting others in and building on it, because you have credibility now that you are doing something and that it will work and it will be successful, and money invested in that is money well spent.
I think a partnership can only work when there is a complementary set of skills and competencies which together could make a difference. So one of the most important partners is the communities in which you work. I think we should not underestimate the power in communities in finding solutions. There's room for many, many players here, and I think we need to share these best practices. There is no blueprint on how to do that, but the elements, I think, of solutions are there, but we need to make sure to fit them together in a way it makes sense. It makes sense for the private sector partner, it makes sense for your public sector partner, but in particular, it makes sense in the society in which you're working.
First, when you think about science and where science is going, you can't do today's modern science without great information technology systems to manage the data and accelerate the growth and lower the cost of new discoveries. Probably more importantly and more immediate is the impact that information technology can have on the supply chain. For the developing world, you're going to need to see more of a distributed system. And in order to make a distributed system really work, you need an incredibly effective information technology supply chain to go along with it. And if cost is a key component of creating better access, we know that information technology and better supply chains lower costs.
I do think it's helpful to have more clarity about our theory of why industry is going to get involved and what are the different models for trying to align public purposes and private interests. Obviously, there's something very powerful about engaging the private sector. If you think about the human capital that the private sector has, its ability to innovate, efficiency, scale, and global reach, and the fact that the private sector engages people's self-interest. So those are all powerful reasons. But I think it's useful to think about why is it that we think they might get engaged? And I think there are a number of different scenarios. One is that there's an investment that has a market return. The second is that you might have a hybrid value chain. Another scenario, and I think one that is really interesting, which is the notion of a social business. That is, can you identify activities that have a 2 to 4% financial return, but a very high social return, and create new financial instruments that are capable of mobilizing capital to support those?